Word of Sarah and James's relationship spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By the end of the week, the entire town was buzzing with gossip about the scarred widow and the hermit mountain man. Sarah noticed the stares and whispers had intensified, but for the first time, they didn't pierce her heart like daggers. She had found something worth more than their approval. James proposed on a crisp morning in late October. They were sitting by the stream in his hidden meadow, watching the last of the aspen leaves drift down like golden snow. He had carved a simple ring from mountain ash wood, polished smooth and warm. "It's not much compared to what most women would expect," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "It's perfect," Sarah replied, meaning every word. The ring represented something no store-bought jewelry could match: time, thought, and love crafted by his own hands. They decided on a simple ceremony at James's cabin with only the minister from the next town over as witness. Pastor Williams had known James for years and readily agreed to perform the service, unlike Pine Ridge's Reverend Harper, who had refused even to speak with them. As their wedding day approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and melancholy. She was beginning a new chapter of her life, but she couldn't help thinking of her first wedding day 7 years earlier. Then, she had been surrounded by family and friends, wearing her grandmother's lace dress, believing her future was guaranteed. Now she understood that nothing in life was guaranteed except the choices you made each day. The night before their wedding, Sarah sorted through her belongings, deciding what to take to her new home. At the bottom of an old trunk, she found a photograph from her first wedding, herself and David, young and hopeful, surrounded by the same people who had later turned their backs on her. James found her holding the photograph, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm just saying goodbye to who I used to be." James sat beside her on the floor, looking at the photograph. "She looks like a lovely person, but I prefer the woman sitting next to me now." "Why?" Sarah asked. "She was prettier, more innocent, less complicated." "She was those things," James agreed. "But you are wiser, stronger, more compassionate. You've been tested by life and proven your character. That's infinitely more attractive than untested youth." Sarah leaned against James's shoulder, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. The woman in the photograph had been beautiful, but fragile. The woman she had become was resilient. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, and James had managed to find a white shirt that almost fit his broad shoulders. Pastor Williams arrived at noon with his wife, who had brought a small cake as a wedding gift. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows on James's porch with the mountains stretching endlessly before them, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. This wasn't the wedding she had once dreamed of, but it was exactly the wedding she needed. "I promise to see you as you truly are," James said during his vows. "Not as others have tried to define you, but as the remarkable woman who chose to build something beautiful from life's ashes." Sarah's voice was steady as she made her own promises. "I promise to trust in your love, to build our life together on truth and respect, and to never let the opinions of others diminish what we create together." When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Sarah with a tenderness that spoke of patience, respect, and deep affection. Mrs. Williams wiped away tears as she watched two people who had both known loss find their way to love. After the pastor and his wife departed, James and Sarah spent their wedding afternoon working together to move her belongings to his cabin. It seemed fitting that their first act as a married couple should be practical collaboration rather than romantic fantasy. That evening, as they sat before their fireplace sharing wedding cake, Sarah reflected on how different this felt from her first marriage. With David, love had been passionate but fragile, built on youth and physical attraction. With James, love felt solid and enduring, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of life's complexities. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Sarah asked as they prepared for bed. "Choosing each other despite what everyone thinks. I think," James replied, "that we're doing the only thing that matters, choosing to build a life based on love and authenticity rather than other people's expectations." Their first months as a married couple brought challenges neither had anticipated. Sarah struggled to adapt to life completely outside Pine Ridge's social circle, while James had to adjust to sharing his carefully ordered space with another person. But they approached each obstacle as partners, talking through difficulties and finding compromises that honored both their needs. Sarah discovered that she loved the isolation of mountain life. After years of feeling watched and judged, the privacy was liberating. She threw herself into learning the skills needed for their self-sufficient lifestyle, preserving food, tending a garden, helping with hunting, and trapping. More importantly, she began to rediscover her love of teaching. James had collected books on every subject imaginable during his years of solitude. Sarah spent winter evenings reading voraciously, then sharing what she learned with James. Their conversations ranged from philosophy to practical science, from literature to current events. "You know," James said one snowy evening after a particularly engaging discussion about poetry, "you shouldn't waste your teaching abilities on just one student." "What do you mean?" "There are children in the mountain communities who have no access to formal education. Their parents might be interested in hiring a teacher who could come to them." The idea had never occurred to Sarah. She had assumed her teaching days were over forever. But James was right. There were scattered homesteads throughout the mountains where families lived too far from town to send their children to school. That spring, Sarah began visiting these isolated families, offering to teach their children basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Word spread quickly about the educated woman who would travel to remote cabins and provide quality instruction for reasonable fees. Unlike the town parents who had rejected her, these mountain families cared only about her ability to help their children learn. Many of the parents had received little education themselves and were grateful to find someone willing to share knowledge with their young ones. Sarah's teaching circuit grew to include 8 families scattered across 30 miles of mountain territory. She and James developed a schedule that allowed her to spend several days with each family during monthly visits, providing intensive instruction and leaving exercises for the children to practice between sessions. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Sarah discovered that her experiences had made her a better teacher than she had been in her youth. She understood now that every child faced unique challenges, and her own struggles with adversity had given her patience and empathy she had never possessed before. One warm summer day, Sarah was teaching a group of children at the Morrison homestead, no relation to the Pine Ridge Morrisons, when a familiar voice called from the yard. She looked up to see Mrs. Henderson approaching with 2 other women from town. Sarah excused herself and walked outside to meet them, curious about what could have brought them so far from Pine Ridge. "Mrs. Crawford," Mrs. Henderson began with obvious reluctance, "we've come to ask a favor." Sarah raised an eyebrow. After their last confrontation, she hadn't expected to see any of these women again. "Our schoolteacher left unexpectedly," Mrs. Henderson continued. "The children have been without instruction for 2 months now, and we haven't been able to find a replacement. We heard about your teaching endeavors in the mountains." "And?" Sarah prompted. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward. "We're prepared to offer you the position. Temporarily, of course, just until we find someone more suitable." Sarah stared at them in amazement. These women had shunned her, insulted her, and demanded she end her relationship with James. Now they wanted her help. "I see," Sarah said calmly. "And what has changed that makes you think I'm qualified to teach your children?" The 3 women exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke. "We've heard good reports about your teaching abilities. Families whose children you've instructed speak highly of your methods. Families you previously wouldn't associate with," Sarah observed. Mrs. Peterson flushed red. "We're willing to overlook your personal circumstances in light of our current need." Sarah felt a familiar anger rising, but this time it was tempered by confidence she hadn't possessed during their last encounter. "Let me understand," Sarah said slowly. "When you needed nothing from me, you made it clear I wasn't welcome in your community. You refused to serve me in your stores and criticized my personal relationships. Now that you need something I can provide, you're willing to temporarily overlook who I am. Is that correct?" The women shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "I'm going to decline your generous offer," Sarah said with a smile. "You see, I've discovered something wonderful since our last conversation. I've learned that there are people in this world who value me for who I am, not just for what I can do for them when they're desperate. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Henderson warned. This is your chance to rejoin civilized society. No, Sarah replied firmly. This is your chance to learn something about character. Real worth doesn't change based on circumstances. A person is either valuable or they're not. You've made it clear what you think of my value. I'm not interested in being your last resort. After the women left, looking frustrated and offended, Sarah returned to her students with a light heart. The little girl she was teaching to read looked up at her with bright, eager eyes. Mrs. Crawford, who were those ladies? Just some people from town who had forgotten something important, Sarah replied. Now, where were we in our story? That evening, Sarah told James about the encounter. He listened with a mixture of pride and amusement. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, he said. But I'm curious, was there any part of you that was tempted by their offer? Sarah considered the question carefully. For about half a second, I wondered what it would be like to have their approval again. But then, I realized I don't want the approval of people whose respect has to be earned through their desperation. I prefer the honest appreciation of mountain families who value education over social status. As autumn returned to the mountains, Sarah and James celebrated their first wedding anniversary. They had built something beautiful together, a life based on mutual respect, shared work, and genuine love. Sarah's teaching practice had grown to include 12 families, and she was already making plans to expand into offering adult literacy classes during the winter months. On their anniversary evening, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah thought about the woman she had been a year earlier, broken, isolated, believing herself worthy only of rejection. Do you ever regret it? She asked James. Choosing to build a life outside conventional society, James took her scarred hand in his whole one, intertwining their fingers. I regret nothing about our life together. We've built something authentic here, something that belongs to us regardless of what anyone else thinks. I used to believe that fitting in was the most important thing in the world, Sarah mused. I thought being accepted by society was necessary for happiness. And now I understand that being true to yourself and building real connections with people who see your worth, that's what matters. I'd rather be rejected by 100 people while being loved authentically by one than be accepted by everyone while hiding who I really am. A year later, Sarah's teaching practice had grown large enough that she was able to establish a small mountain school in a central location. Parents from across the region brought their children for weekly classes, and Sarah found herself teaching everything from basic literacy to advanced mathematics. James built additional rooms onto their cabin to accommodate visiting families and to house Sarah's growing collection of teaching materials. Their home became a center of learning and community for mountain families who had previously had little access to education. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had found her true calling only after society had rejected her. The fire that had taken everything from her had also burned away the need to conform to others' expectations. In losing her old life, she had discovered who she really was. On a crisp morning in late fall, Sarah stood before her classroom of 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. As she watched their eager faces focused on learning, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman she had been before the fire would never have had the courage to build this kind of life. That Sarah had needed approval, had feared standing out, had measured her worth by others' opinions. This Sarah, scarred but strong, rejected but resilient, had learned to create value rather than seek it. When James arrived that afternoon to help escort families safely down the mountain paths, Sarah watched him interact with her students with patient kindness. He had taught her that real love didn't try to fix or change you. It saw who you were and chose you anyway. As they walked home together that evening, their breath visible in the cold air, Sarah realized she had found something she never could have imagined during her darkest days. She had found a love that strengthened rather than diminished her, work that fulfilled rather than merely sustained her, and a sense of self-worth that came from within rather than from others' approval. "Thank you," she said suddenly, as they reached their porch. "For what? For seeing my worth when everyone else saw only damage. For believing I was capable of more than I believed myself. For loving me into becoming who I was meant to be." James pulled her close as the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. Thank you for being brave enough to let yourself be seen and loved. For choosing to build something beautiful instead of staying bitter. For showing me that two people who've been rejected by the world can create their own world together. Inside their warm cabin, surrounded by books and memories and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, Sarah realized she had found what every person searches for. A place where she belonged completely, work that mattered deeply, and love that accepted her entirely. The town that had rejected her continued on without her, never understanding what they had lost. But Sarah had learned the most important truth of all. When society rejects you, sometimes the best response isn't to change yourself to fit back in. Sometimes the best response is to build something better. Sarah spent the entire next day preparing for her dinner with James. She washed her hair with soap made from pine needles, a luxury she had denied herself for months. As she stood before her small mirror, she noticed something different in her reflection. The woman looking back at her had hope in her eyes. At exactly 6 o'clock, James arrived at her door. He wore clean clothes and had trimmed his beard, clearly having made an effort for their evening together. In his hands, he carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers he had gathered from the mountainside. "These are beautiful," Sarah said, accepting the flowers with genuine pleasure. "No one has brought me flowers in years." "Then, people have been fools longer than I thought," James replied simply. The walk to James's cabin took 20 minutes through winding mountain trails. Sarah had expected a rough shelter like the ones she had seen other hermits build. Instead, she discovered a sturdy log home with glass windows, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch that offered stunning views of the valley below. Inside, the cabin was even more impressive. Handcrafted furniture filled rooms warmed by a large stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on everything from philosophy to practical skills. The kitchen smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread. "You built all this yourself?" Sarah asked in amazement. James nodded, stirring something on his wood-burning stove. "Took me 3 years. I wanted a real home, not just a place to survive." The dinner James had prepared was unlike anything Sarah had tasted in recent memory. Fresh venison with herbs he had grown in his garden, vegetables preserved from his summer harvest, and bread that rivaled anything from town bakeries. They ate by candlelight, talking about books, dreams, and the kind of life worth living. "I used to teach literature," Sarah confessed during dessert. "Before I married David, before the fire. I loved introducing young minds to great stories." "What stopped you from teaching again after you recovered?" James asked. Sarah gestured toward her scars. "Who would hire me? Parents complained even when I tried to help at the church. They said I frightened their children." James set down his coffee cup, his expression growing serious. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I wasn't completely honest yesterday about why I live alone up here." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with worry. Had she been foolish to trust him so quickly? 5 years ago, James continued, I was a successful architect in Denver. I had a partnership in a firm, a beautiful apartment, everything that looked good from the outside. But I was engaged to a woman who cared more about status than substance. When I lost my left arm in a construction accident, she broke off our engagement immediately. Sarah's eyes widened as she noticed for the first time that James's left sleeve was pinned up. He had positioned himself throughout their meals so cleverly that she hadn't realized he was missing an arm. "I lost my career, my fiancé, and most of my so-called friends in 1 month," James said matter-of-factly. "That's when I learned that most people only value you for what you can do for them, not who you are. So I came here to build a life based on different values." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "I didn't notice." "That's because you see people, not just their circumstances," James replied. "Just like I see you." After dinner, they sat on James's porch wrapped in warm blankets, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant call of night birds. "James," Sarah said eventually, "why me? There must be women in other towns who would appreciate your company. Women who haven't been marked by tragedy." James turned to look at her directly. "Because tragedy doesn't diminish a person's worth, it reveals it. You could have become bitter after everything you lost. Instead, you've remained kind. You could have left Pine Ridge and started over somewhere else. Instead, you've stayed and face down their rejection with dignity. That takes real strength. I stayed because I was too scared to leave, Sarah admitted. This place is awful to me, but at least it's familiar. Maybe, James said gently. But I think you stayed because you're braver than you give yourself credit for. Their evening ended with James walking Sarah back to her cabin. At her door, he paused. Would you consider letting me show you more of the mountain tomorrow? There are places up there that might help you remember how beautiful the world can be. Sarah surprised herself by agreeing immediately. The next morning, James arrived with 2 horses, his own steady gelding, and a gentle mare he had borrowed from a friend in the next valley. Sarah hadn't ridden in years, but the skill returned quickly. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving Pine Ridge far behind, she felt layers of anxiety and self-consciousness falling away. James led her to a hidden meadow surrounded by aspen trees whose leaves shimmered gold in the autumn sunlight. A clear stream ran through the center, and wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing season. This is my favorite place on earth, James said as they dismounted. I come here when I need to remember what peace feels like. They spent the day exploring the meadow, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. James taught Sarah to identify different bird calls and showed her where wild strawberries grew among the rocks. For hours, Sarah forgot about her scars, forgot about the town's rejection, forgot about everything except the simple pleasure of being alive in a beautiful place with someone who valued her company. As the afternoon wore on, they settled by the stream to eat the lunch James had packed. Sarah watched him handle tasks one-handed with practiced efficiency, never making excuses or drawing attention to his limitation. You've never asked me about the fire, Sarah observed. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to, James replied. Some stories need to be shared, others need to be respected as private. Sarah found herself wanting to share. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of that night alone, unable to talk about it with anyone who would truly listen. David was working late at the mill, she began slowly. Emma was teething, so she was fussy. I put her down for the night and went to bed myself. I woke up to smoke and flames everywhere. James listened without interruption as Sarah told him about crawling through burning hallways, about finding her baby's nursery already consumed by fire, about barely escaping with her own life. She told him about the weeks in the hospital, the surgeries, the moment she looked in a mirror and realized her old life was over. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, Sarah concluded. It was realizing that I had lost not just my family and my home, but my place in the community. People looked at me and saw tragedy. They didn't want to be reminded that terrible things can happen to anyone. Their discomfort says everything about them and nothing about you, James said firmly. You survived something that would have destroyed most people. You kept going when you had every reason to quit. That makes you extraordinary, not damaged. For the first time since the fire, Sarah felt truly heard and understood. James didn't try to minimize her loss or offer empty platitudes. He simply acknowledged her pain and saw her strength. As they rode back down the mountain that evening, Sarah realized something had shifted inside her. The woman who had climbed up that morning had been defined by what others thought of her. The woman riding down was beginning to define herself. Over the following weeks, James and Sarah fell into a comfortable routine. He would visit her cabin several times a week, bringing supplies and conversation. She would accompany him on expeditions to gather firewood, check his traps, and maintain his property. Slowly, Sarah learned skills she had never imagined needing: how to preserve meat, how to identify edible plants, how to repair equipment with whatever materials were available. More importantly, she learned to see herself through James's eyes. He treated her as capable, intelligent, and valuable. When she struggled with self-doubt, he gently challenged her negative thoughts. When she succeeded at new tasks, he celebrated her accomplishments without condescension. One afternoon while they were splitting firewood together, Sarah paused to rest and found James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What are you thinking about? She asked. I'm thinking, James said carefully, that I haven't been this happy in years. And I'm wondering if you might feel the same way. Sarah set down her axe and really looked at him. James Crawford had walked into her life at her lowest moment and treated her with more respect and kindness than anyone had shown her since the fire. With him, she felt like a whole person again. I do feel the same way, she admitted. But, James, what kind of future could we have? I'm damaged goods in this town's eyes. Being associated with me won't do your reputation any favors. James laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Sarah, my reputation in town is that of a crazy hermit who talks to trees. I think associating with you might actually improve how they see me. Despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing too. When had she last laughed with real joy? Besides, James continued more seriously, I'm not interested in their opinion of my choices. I'm interested in building a life with someone who shares my values. Someone who understands that real wealth isn't measured in money or status, but in integrity and connection. That evening, as James prepared to leave Sarah's cabin, he took her hands in his. Sarah, he said, I know this might seem too fast, but I need you to know how I feel. You've brought light back into my life. I love your strength, your kindness, your intelligence. I love the way you see beauty in small things, and the way you refuse to let bitterness consume you despite everything you've endured. Sarah felt her heart racing. James, you don't need to answer now, he said gently. Just know that when I look at you, I see the woman I want to spend my life with. Scars and all. Especially scars and all. After he left, Sarah sat by her fire thinking about his words. For 3 years, she had believed her chance at love and happiness had died in the flames that took her family. James was offering her something she had never expected to find again. Not just love, but love from someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Sarah's cabin. Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch accompanied by 2 other prominent town women, their faces set in expressions of righteous disapproval. We need to talk, Mrs. Henderson announced without preamble. Sarah invited them in, though their hostile energy filled her small space uncomfortably. It's come to our attention, Mrs. Henderson began, that you've been consorting with that mountain man, James Crawford. We're here to warn you that this association reflects poorly on our entire community. Sarah stared at them in amazement. I'm sorry, but what business is it of yours who I spend time with? Pine Ridge has standards, declared Mrs. Morrison, the banker's wife. We can't have our town associated with unseemly behavior. What exactly do you find unseemly about friendship? Sarah asked, her voice growing cold. Don't play innocent, snapped Mrs. Peterson from the church committee. Everyone knows what goes on when a man visits a woman's home unchaperoned. It's scandalous. Sarah felt anger building in her chest. These same women had shunned her, refused to serve her, and made her feel unwelcome in the community. Now they wanted to control her private relationships too. Let me understand this correctly, Sarah said slowly. You've made it clear that I'm not welcome in your stores, your church, or your social circles. But somehow my private life is still subject to your approval? We're offering you a chance to redeem yourself, Mrs. Henderson said pompously. End this inappropriate relationship, and we might consider allowing you back into polite society. Sarah looked at these 3 women who represented everything she had once tried so hard to please. They had never shown her compassion, never offered help when she needed it, never treated her with basic human decency. Now they wanted to dictate how she could find happiness. No, Sarah said simply. The 3 women exchanged shocked looks. Excuse me. I said no, Sarah repeated, standing straighter. James Crawford is the first person in this town to treat me with genuine kindness and respect. He's helped me when no one else would. He's shown me friendship when everyone else showed me their backs. I will not end my relationship with him to earn the approval of people who have proven themselves incapable of basic human decency. Mrs. Henderson's face turned red with anger. Then, you've made your choice. Don't expect any sympathy from us when this ends badly. After they left, Sarah stood in her kitchen trembling with adrenaline. She had just burned her last bridge to Pine Ridge's social acceptance. But, as she thought about James's kindness, his respect for her as a person, his gentle strength, she realized she felt liberated rather than afraid. That afternoon, when James arrived for his usual visit, Sarah met him at the door with news of her confrontation. I'm proud of you, he said simply after she finished her story. It takes courage to reject false friendship in favor of real connection. James, Sarah said, taking a deep breath. Yesterday you said something about building a life together. Did you mean that? His blue eyes searched her face. Every word. Then, Yes, Sarah said, stepping closer to him. Yes, I want to build that life with you. James pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since the fire, Sarah felt completely safe and completely valued. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of Pine Ridge's main street, clutching her worn leather satchel against her chest. The autumn wind whipped through her tangled brown hair as she watched the townspeople hurry past, their eyes deliberately avoiding hers. At 28, she had learned to recognize that particular look of disgust mixed with pity that followed her wherever she went. The scars on the left side of her face told a story she wished she could forget. 3 years ago, a house fire had taken everything from her, her husband, her infant daughter, and the face that had once turned heads in admiration. The flames had spared her life, but branded her with marks that made decent folk uncomfortable. In a small mountain town where appearances mattered more than character, Sarah had become invisible. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of Henderson's general store, the familiar bell chiming overhead. The conversations inside died instantly. Mrs. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, her lips pursing into a thin line of disapproval. "What do you need?" the older woman asked coldly, not bothering with pleasantries. Sarah placed her carefully counted coins on the counter. "Just some flour, sugar, and coffee beans, please." Mrs. Henderson gathered the items with obvious reluctance, her movements sharp and impatient. "That'll be $8.50. Sarah counted out the exact change, her fingers trembling slightly. As she reached for her purchases, Mrs. Henderson pulled them back. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you anymore," the store owner announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My customers have been complaining. Your presence makes them uncomfortable." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had expected this day would come, but the reality still left her breathless. Around the store, other customers nodded in agreement, their faces showing satisfaction at seeing the town's unwanted resident finally put in her place. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have money. I need these supplies." "Find somewhere else to shop," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "Maybe try the next town over. They might be more accommodating." Sarah gathered what remained of her dignity and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard the whispered conversation's resume, punctuated by cruel laughter. The bell's cheerful chime seemed to mock her as she stepped back onto the wooden sidewalk. The nearest town was 40 miles away through dangerous mountain roads. Sarah had no car, no horse, and winter was coming fast. She stood there for a moment, watching her breath form small clouds in the cold air, wondering how much longer she could survive in a place that had decided she didn't belong. That evening, Sarah sat in her small cabin at the very edge of town, staring at her nearly empty pantry. The cabin had been a wedding gift from her late husband's family, but after the fire, they had made it clear she was no longer welcome in their lives. The property was legally hers, which was the only reason she still had a roof over her head. She lit a small fire in the stone fireplace, more for comfort than warmth. The dancing flames reminded her of that terrible night, but she had learned to live with the memories. What hurt more was the slow realization that she would have to leave Pine Ridge or starve. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Sarah rarely had visitors, and never after dark. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the small window beside it. A tall figure stood on her porch, but the darkness made it impossible to see who it was. "Who's there?" she called out. "Name's James Crawford," came a deep, gentle voice. "I heard what happened at Henderson's store today. Thought you might need some help." Sarah had heard of James Crawford, though she had never seen him up close. The mountain man lived alone in a cabin several miles up the ridge, coming to town only when absolutely necessary. People spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was known for his skill as a hunter and his complete indifference to social conventions. Against her better judgment, Sarah opened the door. The man standing before her was nothing like what she had imagined. James Crawford stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and hands that spoke of years of hard work. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his blue eyes held a kindness that Sarah hadn't seen in a long time. Most surprisingly, he looked directly at her scarred face without flinching or turning away. "I brought some supplies," he said simply, gesturing to the canvas bag slung over his shoulder. "Figured you might be running low." Sarah stared at him in confusion. I don't understand. Why would you help me? James smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Because it's the right thing to do. Mind if I come in? It's getting cold out here. Sarah stepped aside, still uncertain but desperate enough to accept help from any source. James entered her small cabin, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller but somehow more secure. He set his bag on her kitchen table and began unpacking items: flour, sugar, coffee, dried meat, and canned goods. Sarah watched in amazement as he filled her pantry with enough food to last several weeks. How much do I owe you? She asked quietly. Nothing, James replied, continuing to unpack. I hunt and trap for most of what I need, and I have connections with suppliers in other towns. This didn't cost me anything special. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over. But why? You don't even know me. James paused in his unpacking and looked at her directly. I know enough. I know you lost everything in that fire and somehow found the strength to keep going. I know the people in this town have treated you badly because they're scared of things they don't understand. And I know that real worth isn't measured by what someone looks like on the outside. The simple honesty in his words broke something loose inside Sarah's chest. For 3 years, she had internalized the town's rejection, believing that perhaps they were right to find her repulsive. But here was this man, this stranger, treating her with more kindness than her own community had shown. Thank you, she whispered, wiping away tears. I was starting to think everyone in the world had forgotten how to be decent. James finished unpacking and turned to face her fully. Sarah Mitchell, isn't it? I've seen you around town. Always wondered why someone with your obvious strength was letting those fools make her feel small. You've been watching me? Hard not to notice when someone's being treated unfairly right in front of you, James admitted. I've been thinking about saying something for a while now. Today just seemed like the right time. Sarah gestured toward her scarred face. Most people can't stand to look at me. Then, most people are blind, James said matter-of-factly. Scars tell stories. Yours tell a story of survival. They talked for another hour, sitting by the fire and sharing coffee from James's supplies. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. James didn't treat her like a victim or an object of pity. He spoke to her as an equal, asking about her thoughts on everything from the changing weather to the best methods for preserving food through winter. When he finally prepared to leave, James paused at the door. Would you mind if I stopped by again in a few days? I don't get much company up on the mountain, and I enjoyed our conversation. Sarah nodded, surprised by how much she wanted to say yes. I'd like that. After he left, Sarah sat by her fire for a long time, thinking about the evening's unexpected turn. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than resignation about her future. James Crawford had looked at her and seen something worth talking to, worth helping, worth knowing. The next morning brought the first snow of the season. Sarah stood at her window, watching the white flakes transform the hostile town into something clean and beautiful. She thought about James's words about scars telling stories of survival. Maybe it was time she stopped letting other people write her story for her. She spent the day cleaning her cabin and herself with more care than she had taken in months. When she looked in the mirror, she tried to see what James had seen, not just the damaged skin, but the woman who had survived the unsurvivable and was still standing. 3 days later, James returned as promised. This time, he brought tools and materials for repairing her cabin's roof, which had been leaking since the last heavy rain. Sarah watched from her porch as he worked with practiced efficiency, his movements sure and confident. You don't have to do this, she called up to him. I know, he called back. I want to. When the work was finished, they sat on her porch together, sharing sandwiches Sarah had made from the supplies he'd brought. The afternoon sun was warm despite the snow on the ground, and Sarah felt more at peace than she had in years. James, she said suddenly, why do you live alone up on the mountain? A man like you could have his pick of companions. James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the tree line. I used to live in the city, he said finally. Had a job, a house, all the things society says a man should want. But I never felt like I belonged there. People seemed more interested in what I could do for them than who I actually was. Up here, life is simpler, more honest. Don't you get lonely? Sometimes, he admitted. But I'd rather be alone with my self-respect than surrounded by people who don't really see me. He looked at her meaningfully. I imagine you understand that feeling. Sarah did understand, more than she could express. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who had decided you didn't matter was worse than any physical isolation could be. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, James stood to leave. Sarah, he said, would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow night? I'd like to cook for you this time. The invitation caught her off guard. You want me to come to your cabin? If you're comfortable with that. I understand if you'd prefer to stay here. Sarah thought about it. The old Sarah, the one who had cared so much about what others thought, would have been terrified of what people might say if they discovered she was visiting a man alone. But that Sarah had died in the fire along with everything else she had lost. I'd like that very much, she said. James's smile was warm enough to chase away the evening chill. I'll come get you at 6. The path to my place can be tricky in the dark. After he left, Sarah found herself humming while she prepared for bed, something she hadn't done since before the fire. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow.